What if the most dangerous enemy you will ever face is the one that lives inside of you? Have you ever considered the possibility that your inner darkness might be subtly directing your life, influencing decisions you believe you're making consciously? This isn't just a philosophical riddle. It's a reality that has profound implications for your personal well-being and for the way you interact with the world. When you fail to recognize the hidden aspects of yourself, you become a pawn in a game you're not even aware of playing. Understanding this hidden force, this inner antagonist, isn't just an abstract concept. It's absolutely vital if you seek true self-awareness, authentic relationships, and personal growth. This hidden force, as Carl Jung articulated, is what he termed the shadow, the repository of all the qualities, impulses, and desires that you have rejected, disowned, or repressed. It's not simply a collection of bad traits. Rather, it encompasses the totality of your unconscious, those parts of yourself that you've been conditioned to believe are unacceptable. These might be traits you find shameful, desires you deem inappropriate, or potentials you've neglected due to societal or familial pressures. This shadow operates beyond the reach of your conscious mind, exerting its influence from the background and shaping patterns of behavior in ways that are hard to see. This is why so many of us live lives that do not feel fully aligned with who we believe ourselves to be. It also plays out in patterns that can seem mysterious, but in reality are all driven by this hidden force. One of the most common ways this hidden shadow emerges is through recurring patterns that play out in our relationships. You might find yourself consistently drawn to partners who possess the very qualities you claim to despise, or you may witness a frustrating cycle of self-sabotage, where you attain success only to inexplicably undermine yourself with reckless choices. These are not random occurrences. They are the shadow's way of making its presence known, trying to get you to pay attention to parts of yourself you are ignoring. The shadow does not simply go away. It is a dynamic force that continues to influence us until we confront it and work towards integrating it into our conscious lives. You may notice patterns where you project your own disowned qualities onto others, which means when you have a strong emotional reaction to another person, this is often just a reflection of something within yourself that you're unwilling to accept. It is as if your own unconscious is showing you something about yourself, but we often are too focused on the external to truly see that our inner darkness is showing itself. It's crucial to understand that this isn't some form of esoteric speculation. It's grounded in the deep psychological explorations of Carl Jung, who dedicated his life to mapping the complexities of the human psyche. Jung's work revealed that the shadow isn't a rare phenomenon, but a universal aspect of the human condition, meaning that every single person possesses one. You might think of yourself as having no shadow or a very small one, but this just means that you're likely not in touch with yours, and likely even more under its influence than you realize. By ignoring it, it does not go away. It simply gains more power and control over our lives. This is why beginning to understand the shadow is so crucial. The shadow is not something that we can run from. Rather, it is something we must understand and learn to integrate in order to become fully human. This is the basis of Jung's idea of individuation, becoming a whole individual by integrating the parts of ourselves that we have disowned and rejected. Ignoring your shadow is not a harmless act of avoidance. It's a dangerous path that leads to a life governed by unconscious forces. When you fail to acknowledge the dark aspects within yourself, you become a puppet of its hidden agenda, making choices that may be counter to your conscious desires and ultimately detrimental to your happiness. It is not just a matter of personal ignorance. It has far-reaching consequences that affect your relationships, your career, and your overall life satisfaction. You might find yourself repeating the same patterns, not understanding why, as if some external force is working against your conscious plans and goals. But it is not an external force, it is the unacknowledged darkness within. In this way, the shadow is your greatest adversary, yet it is also your most potent ally. Moreover, the impact of the unexamined shadow goes far beyond individual lives, influencing collective behavior on a massive scale. When societies fail to understand their collective shadows, they often project these disowned aspects onto scapegoats or minority groups, resulting in prejudice, discrimination, and even larger-scale atrocities. History provides us with numerous examples of these societal shadow projections, from the Salem witch trials to the rise of Nazism, showing how the unacknowledged shadow can lead to immense suffering. The consequences of ignoring this force are staggering, both in our personal lives and in the collective. By recognizing this pattern, we can begin to understand the dangerous effects of an unacknowledged shadow. We all contribute to the collective shadow, which means all of us must take an active role in understanding this immense power. Therefore, understanding your shadow is not merely an interesting intellectual exercise. It's an essential step toward genuine self-awareness and authentic personal growth. True growth and personal transformation is not possible until you become aware of and learn to integrate the darker aspects of your own nature. You must face this inner antagonist, understand its motivations, and learn to work with it if you want to truly take control of your life, instead of being led around by unconscious forces you can't even perceive. By acknowledging the shadow, you gain a critical understanding of your own nature and can begin to make choices that are rooted in your authentic self, rather than being driven by the hidden desires of your unconscious. The journey we're about to embark on isn't about eradicating your shadow. Instead, it's about recognizing it, understanding its function, and integrating it into your conscious awareness. The shadow isn't only a source of our problems, but also contains the seeds of our creativity, our passions, and our vitality. It's a paradox that must be embraced if we are to become whole. We must learn how to make peace with our inner darkness, for that is the only way to step into our true power and become fully human. To fully understand the shadow, we must also briefly examine a few other key concepts from Jungian psychology. First, we need to understand the persona, which is the social mask we wear, the image we present to the world, which is often very different from who we are behind closed doors. And second, we need to explore archetypes, universal patterns of behavior, and images that exist within the collective unconscious, and that shape the way we perceive the world. Both of these concepts are crucial in understanding how the shadow is formed and how it interacts with our conscious self. All of these forces combine to shape our shadow, making it a complex part of our psyche that must be understood. The shadow, therefore, isn't simply a dumping ground for undesirable traits. It's a complex, dynamic force that contains all the parts of ourselves that we have rejected because we deem them as unacceptable. This can include traits that are considered negative, such as aggression or selfishness, but also the very qualities that could be a source of your greatest power, including your ambition, creativity, or passion, but that you were taught to suppress or ignore. The shadow contains a wealth of underdeveloped potentials that, when integrated, can lead to profound personal transformation. These hidden aspects often influence you in ways you can't imagine, and if left unacknowledged, they can manifest in destructive ways in our lives and in our relationships. One way to begin engaging with the shadow is through the use of your dreams and fantasies. These are the realms where the unconscious is most free to reveal its hidden content, offering invaluable insights into the nature of your shadow. These are not random images. They are messages from your unconscious, trying to communicate something important that we are not aware of. By learning to interpret these messages, you can start a meaningful dialogue with your shadow and learn to understand its motivations and its desires. This is not always easy, but it is the key to understanding ourselves on the deepest level. Furthermore, it's also important to understand that the shadow operates through projection. When you have an especially strong reaction to another person, especially if you find them irritating or if you are judging them harshly, this often reflects an aspect of your own shadow that you're unwilling to accept. This unconscious process is often how we see parts of ourselves that we cannot face directly. By understanding this process, you can begin to see your shadow in others, which is the first step toward acknowledging it within yourself. This can be a difficult process, as it often requires us to look at parts of ourselves that are hard to accept, but this is essential to our growth. So, if the shadow is an intrinsic part of us, why do we reject it so vehemently? And what are the long-term implications of ignoring it? These questions will be thoroughly explored throughout this video, and the answers may be more complex and more important than you realize. What if the key to unlocking your true potential lies not in attempting to eradicate your inner darkness, but in understanding and embracing it? This isn't simply about resolving an internal conflict, it's about gaining access to the source of creativity and growth that most people never even realize exists. Consider the dynamics of your own life for a moment. Do you see patterns of self-sabotage? Do you find yourself drawn to specific types of individuals, particularly partners who seem to reflect your darkest qualities? These aren't just random coincidences. These are all clues that your shadow is active and wants to make its presence known, and these are the clues we will explore. And we will begin to understand why you make the choices that you make, and why you are drawn to the people you are drawn to. Up until this point, we've primarily focused on the destructive potential of the unacknowledged shadow, but in the forthcoming sections of this video, we'll delve into its opposite side. What if the darkness of your shadow contains hidden treasures, a wellspring of creative potential and power just waiting to be tapped into? What if all the things you have rejected about yourself are the key to your personal transformation? Stay with me, because the insights that we're about to explore will completely alter the way you view your own inner darkness, and ultimately, yourself. So, how exactly does this unintegrated shadow manifest in our lives, and what are the specific patterns we should be watching out for? The effects are far from subtle. They weave their way into the very fabric of our existence, often undermining our best intentions and causing havoc in our relationships, careers, and our personal lives. Procrastination, for example, isn't simply laziness. It's frequently a manifestation of an unconscious fear of failure, of not measuring up to the standards we believe we must meet. Self-sabotage, which can take many forms, is not random or accidental, but rather a carefully orchestrated plan by the shadow to keep us from confronting the unknown, from taking the risks that are essential for growth, and keeping you safely within the confines of what it deems acceptable. The sudden outbursts of anger that many people experience are not simply a failure of self-control, but are often an eruption of repressed feelings, emotions that the conscious mind refuses to acknowledge. Addictions, whether they are to substances, behaviors, or relationships, all act as a desperate attempt to fill a void, a hole created by the disconnection from our authentic self, and the shadow is always right there to take the wheel. These are not isolated incidents. They are all part of a larger pattern, driven by unconscious forces, and they all point to an unintegrated shadow that needs to be understood. Consider the case of a seemingly successful entrepreneur who consistently manages to undermine their own progress. They might be on the verge of landing a major deal, but then they suddenly miss a crucial deadline or have a conflict with a key investor, seemingly for no reason. It's as if an invisible force is working against them, preventing them from achieving their goals. This isn't just poor planning or bad luck. It's often the shadow at play, driven by hidden insecurities or fears of success. The shadow, in this case, might be terrified of the responsibility that comes with success, preferring the safety of the familiar, even if the familiar is a life of dissatisfaction and limitation. Similarly, in relationships, many find themselves drawn to partners who trigger their deepest insecurities, thus replaying old traumas and never really escaping them. For example, a person who always seeks approval might be inexplicably drawn to a partner who is constantly critical of them, which repeats a childhood pattern that has never been resolved or even acknowledged. This dynamic isn't coincidental, It's a manifestation of the shadow seeking to recreate the very conflicts that it's trying to resolve, and in many cases, it will simply repeat that pattern indefinitely until it is confronted. This process is not conscious, but rather an unconscious pattern of the shadow at play. The cycle of self-sabotage is deeply insidious. It's not simply a matter of making bad choices. It's an unconscious attempt to fulfill a shadow agenda, a pattern of behavior that is designed to keep us from straying too far from the patterns that the shadow is most comfortable with. When we are on the cusp of achieving something significant, something that might challenge our self-image or push us outside of our comfort zone, the shadow will step in to undermine our progress. It's as if there's an internal battle between the conscious desires and the shadow's hidden needs and fears, and too often the shadow wins because it operates outside of our conscious awareness, and it is far more powerful than the conscious mind. Consider a writer who has always dreamed of publishing a novel, but then procrastinates endlessly, finding countless excuses to avoid the work. They might tell themselves that they're just not motivated, but the real reason might be an unconscious fear of being judged, or a deep-seated belief that they're not good enough, and these beliefs are held within the shadow. When we try to become something new, our shadow becomes activated, and it will try to keep you within the limitations of its own fears and beliefs. This self-sabotaging behavior is not random. It's a manifestation of the shadow trying to keep us from confronting our fears and insecurities, thus keeping us in a self-made prison. And unless we see it, we will just repeat the same patterns over and over again. To further understand these patterns, we can turn to archetypal figures that embody the destructive aspects of the shadow. The tyrant, for example, represents the shadow's desire for power and control at any cost. This can manifest in individuals who become ruthless in their pursuit of success, or leaders who become abusive of their power, which means we also carry that potential in our shadow. The victim archetype is a shadow figure that plays out as a way to avoid personal responsibility. We might see this in someone who consistently blames others for their misfortunes, refusing to acknowledge their own role in their difficulties. The saboteur is yet another shadow archetype, the part of us that undermines our own happiness or success as if we don't deserve it. Think of the self-pitying characters in literature, or the villain who always has a reason for his actions. These are often reflections of our own shadow at play. These archetypes aren't just fictional characters, they exist within our own psyche, influencing our behaviors and shaping our interactions with others. And we often see these patterns play out in our relational patterns. Someone who often plays the victim in relationships does so to avoid facing the parts of themselves they have rejected, always blaming the other, never looking within. These shadow archetypes are not random, and they are very common, and it is by recognizing them in ourselves and others that we can start to see the role that the shadow plays in our lives. This brings us to the crucial concept of shadow projection, which is one of the primary ways that the shadow shows up in our daily lives, often without us even realizing it. Shadow projection is a psychological mechanism where we unconsciously attribute our own disowned traits, desires, or feelings to others. It's as if we're seeing our own shadow reflected in the world around us, but instead of recognizing it as our own, we perceive it as something that belongs to someone else. This is not a conscious act. It's a subtle, hidden process of the unconscious, which is why we often are unaware of doing it. For example, someone who is constantly annoyed by their colleagues' arrogance might fail to see their own hidden desire for recognition. They are seeing their own shadow, but they cannot see it, so they project it onto their colleague. Similarly, a person who is quick to judge others for their perceived flaws might be projecting their own insecurities and self-criticism. Whenever we have a strong emotional reaction to someone, it is worth pausing and asking yourself if this might be a reflection of your own shadow. This is not easy to do, as it can be deeply uncomfortable to look at the things we dislike in others and realize that these are often things that we also possess. These projections also play out in recurring relational patterns. It's often said that we are drawn to people who are our opposite, and in many cases, this is a very accurate description of how the shadow works. We often choose partners who embody the very traits we dislike in ourselves, thus recreating repeating cycles of conflict and misunderstanding. For example, a nice person who always avoids conflict might be attracted to a more chaotic and volatile partner. This isn't just a matter of having different personalities. It's often a manifestation of the shadow seeking to integrate disowned traits. The nice person might be unconsciously attracted to the volatile partner because their shadow desires the assertiveness or the edge that they lack, and they project this onto their partner, not seeing that the volatile partner is showing them something about themselves. This dynamic sets up a vicious cycle of constant conflict, where each partner is merely acting out their own shadow dramas. This is a very common dynamic, and one that is worth examining carefully. We often seek a partner that embodies what we fear and reject, thereby reenacting an internal conflict, and this will continue to repeat until the individuals within the relationship are able to see the shadow dynamics that are at play. This process of shadow projection is also at play on a larger scale, in the collective. Societies often project their shadows onto scapegoats and other groups, leading to prejudice, discrimination, and violence. Throughout history, we can see this pattern play out over and over again. Political movements, for instance, might project their shadow onto certain minority groups, blaming them for society's problems. The rise of Nazism in Germany is a glaring example of a society projecting its shadow onto the Jewish population, leading to horrific atrocities. This is not simply a historical anomaly. It's a pattern that continues to repeat in various forms. People often find it easier to blame an external enemy than to confront their own internal demons. This tendency to project our shadow onto others allows us to avoid taking responsibility for our own role in societal problems, perpetuating cycles of conflict and oppression. This is a pattern we must understand if we are to ever create a more just and peaceful world. At this point, it's important to make a crucial shift in perspective, because the shadow is not merely a source of negativity. It's a complex part of the human psyche, and in reality, it contains untapped strengths, hidden talents, and a great deal of creative potential. The qualities that we reject, the parts of ourselves that we hide, often contain hidden gifts that can be discovered if we are willing to do the work. What if your greatest weaknesses are actually strengths waiting to be acknowledged? What if our most challenging traits contain the seeds of our greatest gifts? For instance, a person who has always been seen as too sensitive might discover that their emotional depth is actually their greatest strength, allowing them to connect with others on a profound level. Or a person who has always been told that they are too aggressive might realize that their assertiveness is a powerful tool for making their dreams a reality. Many of the qualities we reject contain important lessons for us that we are missing out on. This reveals that the shadow has much more to offer us than simply its negativity. By denying our shadow, we are cutting ourselves off from a powerful source of creative energy. The shadow contains all of the parts of ourselves that we have deemed as unacceptable, which often include the very traits that make us unique, dynamic, and passionate. Think of the artist who incorporates their dark and disturbing feelings into their work, or a leader who is aware of their shadow side and uses this awareness for greater insight and compassion. These individuals are not afraid to delve into the depths of their own nature, and as a result, they are able to tap into a powerful wellspring of creativity and authenticity. This creative force is often hidden within the shadow, waiting for us to embrace it. We often believe that creativity only comes from the light, but in reality, it is a much more complex dynamic. The shadow is an enormous source of creative and dynamic energy if you know how to access it. It is not something to be feared, but rather understood and embraced. The shadow is not separate from who we are. It is the disowned part of who we are, and by disowning it, we are only limiting our true potential. The real work lies in acknowledging and integrating our shadow, rather than trying to eliminate it. This is not an easy task. It's a lifelong journey that requires us to face our inner darkness with honesty and courage. It's a path that goes against our inherent tendency to reject parts of ourselves and to push them into the unconscious. This process requires us to develop a relationship with the shadow. Some people spend years in therapy trying to understand their shadow, which is a testament to the work that is involved. But it is also the most powerful work that one can do to become a whole individual. This is not a quick fix. It's a process of becoming more aware and more accepting of all parts of ourselves, including the dark. It is essential that we understand that it's not about eliminating our shadow, but about understanding it, integrating it, and allowing it to become part of our lives. The internal battle with the shadow is what leads to inner conflict and unhappiness. The shadow is not an external force. It's a part of our own psyche that needs to be understood. The parts of ourselves that we have rejected will continue to haunt us until we choose to acknowledge them. Imagine someone who is constantly at war with themselves because they refuse to acknowledge their shadow. This inner conflict is often the root cause of anxiety, depression, and many other psychological issues that cannot be resolved until the shadow is understood and integrated. The path to inner peace is not by getting rid of our shadow, but by making peace with it. This inner work is often the most difficult work to do, as it requires us to face our own darkness, and many people are too afraid or unwilling to go on that journey. The path toward wholeness involves embracing all parts of ourselves, including the shadow. Self-acceptance isn't about condoning bad behavior, it's about understanding the hidden forces within us. Self-acceptance means acknowledging our mistakes and learning from them, rather than letting our shadow dictate our behavior. It means taking responsibility for our own actions and working to change any pattern that we deem unhealthy or unhelpful. This path requires courage, as it means facing the very things that we tend to push away or deny. However, it is the only way to become a truly authentic individual and to step into our true power. It's about finding the wisdom and power hidden within the dark aspects of our nature and turning these into tools for growth and transformation. Now that we've explored the destructive power of the unacknowledged shadow, and we've begun to see that it also contains enormous potential, we can start to look at ways to integrate it. This isn't just a matter of theory. It is about taking practical steps to become more whole, more authentic human beings. What if the first step to personal transformation lies in learning how to make peace with your inner darkness? Stay with me as we now turn our attention to the process of integration and the steps we can take to become more conscious of our shadow. So, how do we begin to recognize the shadow in our daily lives, and what specific awareness practices can help us to uncover it? The shift from theory to practice begins with becoming a careful observer of ourselves, noticing the patterns that often go unnoticed. The shadow doesn't live in a remote part of our psyche. It's present in the everyday decisions we make, the relational conflicts we experience, and the emotional reactions we have. It's in the small things, just as much as the larger ones. Take, for example, a person who always feels the need to control every situation. This might manifest in seemingly innocent ways, such as dictating how a group project is run or micromanaging their partner's schedule. However, beneath this need for control, there may lie a deeper fear of chaos, of not being able to handle uncertainty. This fear is an aspect of their shadow, a part of themselves that they have rejected or denied. Another example can be seen when a minor disagreement with a partner suddenly escalates into a major conflict, with harsh words and emotional reactions that seem disproportionate to the situation. This is not simply a matter of two people disagreeing. It's often a reflection of unconscious shadow traits that are being triggered by the other person. Perhaps one person's sensitivity triggers the other person's need to dominate, or someone's need for space triggers another's fear of abandonment. When we are triggered by another person, we should start to examine where this is coming from within ourselves. Even a seemingly innocent comment at work can trigger a strong negative emotional reaction, revealing the shadow at play. Perhaps someone is praised for their innovative ideas, and another person suddenly feels a surge of jealousy or anger seemingly out of nowhere. This can often reveal hidden insecurities or an unacknowledged desire for recognition. These are just a few examples of how the shadow is active in our day-to-day lives, and the more aware we become of these patterns, the more opportunities we create for understanding them. This is not to say that the other person is not at fault, but only to say that we can only ever change ourselves, and understanding the shadow dynamics at play can give us clarity on our own reactions, and from that place, we can make better choices. To begin this journey of self-discovery, we need tools that help us to become more aware and to start identifying the specific triggers that are activating our shadows. Self-reflection and journaling are indispensable tools for this process, and these are practices that are available to everyone. Journaling isn't merely writing down the day's events. It's an act of turning inward, creating a space to explore your inner world and to have a dialogue with your shadow. It's a place to begin to see the patterns that you are participating in that may have been invisible to you before. Simply writing out your reactions, your emotions, and your impulses can reveal hidden patterns and dynamics that often go unnoticed. This process allows the shadow to come into the light of consciousness, so you can observe it without judgment. For example, you might start a journaling session by focusing on a specific interaction that triggered a strong emotional response. Maybe a colleague said something that made you feel deeply angry, or a friend's comment left you feeling anxious. Instead of simply reacting, you can use your journal to explore the reasons behind your reactions. Ask yourself, what specific quality in that person triggered you, and what does this say about the qualities I might be disowning in myself? What aspects of yourself might be triggered, and why? What specific feelings are present? Anger, sadness, shame, fear. And where do these feelings come from? What was the initial feeling that came up first? By examining these questions with honesty and curiosity, you begin to uncover the shadow's hidden agenda. Don't be surprised if these questions feel difficult to answer, and it may take time for these answers to become clearer. This is an ongoing process that requires patience, persistence, and above all, an open mind. To start, you can ask yourself questions such as, when do I feel most irritated by others, and what qualities do they display? What are my most frequent emotional reactions, and what triggers them? Or, in what situations do I tend to act in ways that I later regret or feel ashamed of? By writing down your responses to these questions, you begin a journey of self-discovery, unveiling the hidden aspects of your shadow. The key is to be honest with yourself and to explore your inner world with curiosity rather than judgment. This is where the true work begins and where you create a new level of awareness within yourself. And from this awareness comes the possibility of change. Dreams are another powerful portal into the unconscious, often revealing the hidden dynamics of the shadow. They are not random occurrences, but rather symbolic representations of our inner world. Dreams often present us with the very aspects of ourselves that we have rejected or disowned. These shadow figures may appear in our dreams as dark, menacing, or disturbing figures, and they are always trying to tell us something. Learning to interpret the symbolism of our dreams can provide invaluable insight into our unconscious, helping us to better understand and integrate our shadow. For example, a dream featuring a menacing figure might represent the dreamer's repressed anger or fear, qualities they have denied in their conscious life. Or perhaps the dreamer is constantly confronted by a shadowy figure, which may be a representation of parts of themselves that they have been ignoring. These figures are not random. They are symbols of aspects of ourselves that we need to recognize. Dreams often use symbols, metaphors, and stories to communicate with us, and each symbol has a specific meaning that is personal to the individual. The color, the characters, the setting, and even the emotions are all symbols worth exploring. In fact, any detail you remember from the dream is worth exploring. To begin a basic dream journal practice, keep a notebook near your bed and record your dreams as soon as you wake up. Don't worry about making sense of them at first. Simply record them in as much detail as you can, including any feelings and emotions you experienced. This is like having a direct communication line with your unconscious, and the more you practice, the more fluent you will become in understanding the messages your unconscious is trying to send to you. As you record your dreams over time, you will start to notice patterns and symbols that repeat themselves, and these are often the key to unlocking your shadow. Pay attention to the feelings that you experience in the dream. Are you afraid, angry, sad, or confused? These are all important pieces of the puzzle that will help you to understand your shadow. As you engage with this practice, you may be surprised at what you learn about yourself and how these hidden aspects reveal themselves. The key is to pay attention and to trust that your unconscious knows what it's doing. It's important not to judge the dreams, but simply to observe them and see what they are trying to tell you. Dreams are an invaluable tool for uncovering your shadow and should not be ignored. Moving beyond simple observation, we can also actively engage with our shadow through a powerful Jungian technique known as active imagination. This isn't just passive daydreaming. It's a deliberate and conscious effort to engage with the symbolic imagery of our unconscious and to actually have a dialogue with it. It's a method of meditation where you actively engage with the symbolic imagery that arises in your mind, and it's a way to enter into a dynamic relationship with the unconscious. Active imagination allows you to bring the shadow into the light of consciousness and to start a process of integration. It's a way to meet with your shadow directly and to see what it has to say. This method can bring up strong emotions and is not for the faint of heart. It's important to be in a safe space when you undertake this practice. This process goes beyond simply thinking about your shadow, as it encourages you to directly interact with it in a symbolic form. Unlike daydreaming, where your thoughts drift aimlessly, active imagination involves a conscious, focused effort to engage with the inner world and to be present to whatever arises. This practice invites the unconscious to speak in its own language through symbols and images, and these images will always have something to tell us if we pay attention. The goal isn't to control or censor the unconscious, but rather to listen to it and to allow it to express itself without judgment. The unconscious has its own agenda, its own unique way of communicating, and active imagination is a method for engaging with it directly. It's a way to consciously step into a dialogue with the unconscious and to engage with its wisdom and understanding. This practice is more powerful than simply observing the shadow, as it gives you an active role in the process, and by actively engaging with the shadow, you have the opportunity to transform it. To engage in active imagination, you first need to create a calm and focused environment, somewhere you can be uninterrupted for a period of time. Find a comfortable space, take a few deep breaths, and allow your mind to settle. Once you feel centered, begin to visualize your shadow. You might see it as a dark figure, a shadowy form, or even a specific person. There is no right or wrong way to visualize your shadow. It will appear to you in the way that is most relevant. Allow the image to come into focus without trying to force it. Once you have a clear image, begin to engage with it. You can ask it questions such as, "Who are you?" or "What do you want?" Allow the shadow to speak in its own voice without censoring or interrupting it. It's important to allow it to express itself freely, even if it says things that are unpleasant or unsettling. The shadow will always be honest, as it has no reason to lie, and the purpose of this exercise is to bring its wisdom into consciousness. The shadow's voice might surprise you, but remember that it's an aspect of yourself, and you need to hear what it has to say. You might ask it what it wants, and why it is acting the way it is, or what you might learn from it. This is not a process of becoming lost in the unconscious, but instead, it's a way to understand it. The unconscious often operates in metaphor, and this process gives it an opportunity to reveal itself. Engage with this symbolic imagery as if it were real, allowing yourself to be fully present in this inner dialogue. It's important to note that this process can be very intense, and you may have strong emotional reactions. It's important not to suppress these reactions, but rather to allow yourself to feel them. This is a way to begin to understand the depth of the shadow's influence and to start a process of integration. Active imagination is a safe space to explore the dark aspects of your psyche, and it can offer profound insights into your inner world. The key is to approach it with courage, curiosity, and a willingness to learn, and to be open to whatever might arise. This is where the real transformation can begin. Through active imagination, you start to understand the shadow and engage with it in a new way, as you move beyond just observing the shadow to engaging with it directly. This opens up possibilities for personal transformation that are not available through other means. By giving your shadow a voice, you create a space for dialogue and understanding. This can transform negative inner monologues into productive conversations, giving you a new level of self-awareness and understanding. It's not just about understanding your shadow, it's about learning to work with it and using its energy for positive change. For example, someone who has always struggled with anger might discover, through active imagination, that their anger is actually a form of hidden passion or strength. This insight doesn't justify their anger, but it helps them to understand the underlying dynamic, and it gives them new ways to work with it. This new understanding of the shadow can lead to unexpected creative breakthroughs, allowing us to tap into a wellspring of energy and creativity. By embracing the shadow, we can become more fully ourselves. This is not a process of taming the shadow, but rather of integrating its energy into our conscious lives. And through this integration, we become more whole, more dynamic, and more authentic. Active imagination is a powerful tool for personal transformation, and it can help us move closer to the wholeness that we all seek. It's a way to transform our relationship with our shadow, from one of conflict to one of collaboration, which ultimately allows us to move forward on our journey. And this is the key to understanding the process of integration. It's not about eliminating the shadow, but about understanding, accepting, and integrating it into our conscious lives. So, how does this understanding of the shadow translate into our daily lives? And how can we start to recognize its often unseen influence? It's one thing to understand the theory, and quite another to see how the shadow manifests in real-time situations. The shadow doesn't announce itself with fanfare. It often operates subtly, influencing our decisions, reactions, and interactions without our conscious awareness. To truly understand its presence, we must become keen observers of our own behavior, noticing the patterns that often go unnoticed. Imagine a scenario where a colleague receives praise for a project you also worked on. You might find yourself feeling an unexpected surge of resentment or jealousy. This isn't simply a matter of feeling slightly disappointed. It's the shadow revealing a hidden desire for recognition, a part of yourself that you might be disowning. The intensity of your reaction is the key, and it signals that something deeper is at play. Or consider a situation where you are consistently critical of others. You might believe that you are simply being discerning or having high standards, but this could also be a manifestation of your shadow, where you are projecting your own self-criticism onto those around you. It's often easier to point out flaws in others than it is to acknowledge them within ourselves. The shadow often works in the background, quietly influencing your perceptions, and it's these subtle behaviors that can provide you with some of the clearest clues. It's not about judging your reactions, but about understanding their origin. It's about recognizing that these are not random events, but are manifestations of hidden dynamics within your own psyche. These patterns are often not obvious, and they can hide in plain sight, but with awareness, and by being a careful observer of yourself, you can start to see these patterns more clearly. Are there situations where you overreact, where your emotional response feels disproportionate to the situation at hand? These moments are often the clearest indicators that the shadow is active and that something needs to be examined. Beyond these specific scenarios, our emotional reactions often serve as a direct signal of shadow activity, and specific trigger points can provide invaluable insights. These aren't simply bad emotions, but rather they are signals that something is trying to come to light. When we experience strong reactions, like defensiveness, anger, or jealousy, these are often signs that we have come into contact with some part of our disowned self. For example, take a situation where someone feels intensely defensive when they are criticized. They might immediately counterattack or shut down, rather than listening to what is being said. This defensiveness can be a clear indication that their shadow contains deep-seated insecurities or a hidden fear of not being good enough. They are reacting to an internal fear that is being triggered by an external source. Or consider the feeling of excessive anger, especially when it appears disproportionate to the situation. This anger can be a sign of repressed emotions or unmet needs that are being expressed through the shadow. Often, anger can be a way to mask other emotions, such as sadness, fear, or shame. It is a way to express discomfort without revealing what is actually causing it. Learning to recognize these signals is the first step toward gaining control over your shadow behavior. It's about developing self-awareness and about understanding that your emotional responses are not random. They are often deeply connected to the aspects of yourself that you have disowned. Jealousy is another significant trigger, and when we experience this emotion intensely, it can often reveal our own hidden desires and insecurities. If you are jealous of someone's success, it might be a sign that you have a hidden desire for success and that you also have a fear of failure. The very thing you are jealous of is the very thing you are denying to yourself. These emotions are not to be ignored or suppressed, but they should be explored. They are signposts that lead us back to our hidden selves. And by understanding their origin, we can start to integrate them into our conscious awareness. This is not a process of becoming emotionless, but instead, it's about becoming more aware and more in control of our emotional reactions. These shadow dynamics often play out in our relationships, creating repeating patterns that can cause a great deal of conflict and dissatisfaction. Our partners often unknowingly trigger aspects of our shadow, and in turn, we trigger aspects of theirs. This dynamic can lead to a cycle of conflict that seems almost impossible to break. But by understanding these patterns, we can start to make more conscious choices in our relationships. For example, it is common to see a relationship where one partner is constantly critical and the other is constantly seeking approval. In this dynamic, the critical partner is likely projecting their own self-criticism onto the other, and the partner who is seeking approval is likely projecting their own lack of self-worth onto the other. They are both playing out the dynamics of the shadow without being aware of it. These roles are often a reflection of deep-seated insecurities that each person is trying to cope with. Or consider a relationship where one partner is very independent and the other is very clingy. In this dynamic, the independent partner might be disowning their need for connection, and the clingy partner might be disowning their need for autonomy. They are unconsciously triggering each other's shadows, and this cycle repeats itself. These patterns are not random. They are the shadow's way of showing us the parts of ourselves that we have disowned. It's like a dance where each person is playing a role based on their own unconscious patterns. These repeating patterns can be very frustrating, but they are also an invitation to go deeper into self-understanding. To begin to recognize these dynamics, ask yourself, what types of people do I seem to always attract? Do I find myself in similar relational patterns over and over again? If the answer is yes, then these could be an indication of shadow projections. It's about recognizing that these patterns are not accidents. They are reflections of your inner world, and they offer valuable clues about what needs to be addressed. Understanding this dynamic can shift the focus from blaming our partners to understanding ourselves. This doesn't absolve them of responsibility, but it does allow us to make more conscious choices, to break free from these repeating patterns. This is not easy work, but it's essential for creating healthier relationships and a more fulfilling life. So, how do we begin this journey of inner exploration, and how do we move from simply observing the shadow to actively engaging with it? Self-inquiry serves as a foundational practice for exploring these hidden realms of our psyche, and journaling offers a powerful and direct method for this. This process isn't about casual writing. It's about using specific prompts to dig deeper into your unconscious and to explore the hidden aspects of your shadow. This approach allows for direct communication with your unconscious, and it's a way to reveal hidden beliefs, traumas, and patterns that often operate beneath the surface. To begin this practice, you can find a quiet space where you will not be interrupted and set the intention to explore your inner world. Start with a question and allow your thoughts and feelings to flow freely onto the page without censoring them. Don't worry about making sense of it or writing perfectly, but instead focus on the raw, unfiltered expression of your inner world. Over time, this process becomes a powerful tool, and it helps you to become more aware of the shadow's presence in your daily life. This is not just about writing down your experiences, but it's about using writing as a method to enter into dialogue with yourself and to begin to understand the inner forces that are driving your behavior. By engaging in this practice, you are creating a space for transformation and a space where you can begin to integrate these disowned aspects of yourself. It requires honesty, vulnerability, and a willingness to face the uncomfortable truths that lie within. Don't be surprised if this process feels difficult at first, but it will become easier over time, and the more you practice, the more you will learn. By being persistent and consistent, journaling can become one of the most powerful tools you have for self-discovery. To deepen this self-inquiry practice, consider using specific journaling prompts designed to uncover hidden shadow aspects. These prompts act as catalysts, helping to bring to light the parts of yourself that you might be disowning or rejecting. Start by asking yourself, when do I feel most ashamed? And allow yourself to explore the feelings and situations that arise from this question. The answers will always be deeply personal and revealing. Or consider the question, what are my deepest fears? And explore the hidden anxieties that may be influencing your actions. These fears are often tied to our shadow, and they can offer valuable clues about the disowned aspects of ourself. Another powerful question is, who do I dislike most, and why? This question often leads to discovering that the very qualities that we dislike in others are often the same qualities that we are disowning in ourselves. The things that bother us most about others often point to what we reject about ourselves. As you explore these questions, be open to whatever arises, and don't censor your thoughts or feelings. The goal is to allow the shadow to reveal itself so you can better understand its influence on your life. There are no right or wrong answers, and the key is to explore your inner world with curiosity and compassion. This is not a process of self-judgment, but instead, it's an act of self-discovery. By engaging in this type of journaling, you are creating a safe space to explore the darker aspects of your personality, and you're creating the space to move toward integration. Each question opens a new door and is an invitation to go deeper into your understanding of yourself. This process requires courage, but it will ultimately lead you to a more complete understanding of who you truly are. As you engage in this self-inquiry practice, make sure to look for patterns and recurring themes in your journal entries. These patterns are not random occurrences, but rather they are clues that reveal the shadow's influence, and they can offer invaluable insight into your inner workings. If certain themes or specific figures keep appearing in your writing, it's important to pay close attention to them, as they often represent the areas that need the most attention. For example, if you find yourself repeatedly writing about feelings of anger or resentment, then this could indicate that your shadow is expressing some form of unexpressed rage. Or if you find a particular character appearing in your journal entries over and over again, then this figure could represent a disowned aspect of your personality. These figures are not random, but they are often manifestations of a hidden archetype, and they are trying to communicate with you. By tracking these patterns over time, you begin to create a more comprehensive understanding of your inner world and a map of your shadow. It's not just about looking at one entry at a time, but rather, it's about seeing the big picture and how your shadow is manifesting across different situations. This process will often reveal the core conflicts that you are struggling with, as well as the areas where you might be sabotaging yourself. These repeating patterns are always trying to tell you something, and when you pay attention, they will guide you towards a deeper level of self-awareness. This is not a process of becoming perfect, but instead, it's about becoming more conscious and understanding that your shadow is always trying to get your attention. It is up to you to listen, and with this awareness, you can start to take steps towards integration. Having explored self-inquiry, it's now time to revisit the concept of active imagination, as this is a way to directly communicate with the shadow. This is not just a theoretical exercise, it's a practical method that you can use to engage with your unconscious on a deeper level. It's not about passive daydreaming, but instead, it's a conscious and deliberate effort to engage with the symbolic world of your inner psyche. Active imagination involves visualization, dialogue, and a conscious interaction with the imagery that arises from your unconscious, and it offers a powerful way to engage with your shadow in a safe and controlled environment. By using your imagination in this way, you can begin to unravel the mysteries of your inner world. It's like stepping into a dream while you are fully awake and having a conversation with the characters that emerge. This process can bring forth surprising revelations and offer new perspectives on long-standing issues. You are not just thinking about your shadow. You are directly interacting with it, and you are creating a space where you can learn from its wisdom. This method can often lead to unexpected and transformative insights, and it allows you to engage with the shadow in a very powerful way. It's like shining a light into the dark corners of your psyche, and this can be a very intense experience, so it's important to approach this work with care and respect. This is not about controlling the shadow, but about understanding it and integrating it into your conscious life. To start, create a calm and quiet space, free from distractions, where you can feel safe and undisturbed. Close your eyes, take a few deep breaths, and allow your mind to settle, and then set the intention to engage with your shadow. Once you feel centered, begin to visualize your shadow. Allow whatever image arises to come into focus without trying to control or censor it. Your shadow might appear as a dark figure, an animal, or even a specific person. There is no right or wrong way for the shadow to appear, and it will manifest in whatever way is most relevant to your own personal unconscious. Once you have a clear image, begin to engage with it. You can ask it questions such as, "Who are you? What do you want from me?" Or, "Why are you sabotaging me?" Allow the shadow to speak in its own voice, without interrupting or judging it, and be open to the answers that it provides. The answers may surprise you or even unsettle you, but they always contain valuable insights into your unconscious. You might be tempted to censor the shadow's responses, but it's important to allow it to express itself freely. The goal is to get a clear understanding of your inner dynamics, and you need to be honest about what you are experiencing. The shadow may express difficult or challenging truths, but it will always be honest. By being open to this dialogue, you create a space for transformation, and the more you engage with this process, the deeper your understanding will become. Through this dialogue with your shadow, you may start to uncover hidden fears, desires, and traumas that are operating beneath the level of consciousness. You might start to see how the shadow is influencing your daily life and discover patterns of self-sabotage or ways of relating to others that you never understood before. By facing these hidden aspects of yourself with compassion, you can begin the process of transforming them. This is not a process of eliminating the shadow, but of integrating it into your conscious awareness. It's about bringing the darkness into the light so that you can work with it and use its energy for positive change. The shadow, when understood and accepted, can be a powerful source of creativity and personal growth, and what once seemed like an enemy can become an ally. By facing it with compassion and curiosity, you can start to transform its influence on your life. Active imagination is a way to engage with your shadow with intention, and it often leads to surprising revelations and a deeper level of self-acceptance. And this is the very beginning of the journey towards wholeness. As you develop a relationship with your shadow, you will start to see it not as something to fear, but as a valuable and essential part of yourself. The ultimate goal is to create a sense of harmony with all the different parts of yourself, both light and dark. This brings us to the concept of shadow integration, which is the understanding that it is not about eliminating the shadow, but about accepting it and making peace with all of our aspects, both light and dark. This is a lifelong journey and not a destination, and it is a journey of self-acceptance that is never finished. It's not about becoming perfect, but about becoming more whole and more authentic. We're all a complex mosaic of different aspects, some that we like and some that we dislike, and it is through this acceptance that we can truly be free. We are not meant to be one-dimensional, and our wholeness comes from embracing the entirety of our being, the parts we love and the parts we reject. This is not about condoning bad behavior or justifying our dark side, but instead, it is about understanding it and making conscious choices that are in alignment with our values. It's about transforming our relationship with the shadow and understanding that it is a part of who we are. It's about seeing the shadow not as an enemy, but as an essential part of ourselves. And by embracing this concept, we can move towards a greater sense of wholeness. This integration process is not an easy one, but it's the only way to truly become ourselves. And this is where the real work begins, understanding that the shadow is not an enemy to be defeated, but a part of ourselves to be understood and integrated. We must then shift our focus from trying to eliminate the shadow to learning to manage its manifestations in our daily lives. This is not about denying our shadow, but rather about developing the ability to recognize and understand its influence in the moment. And through the practice of self-awareness, we can begin to shift from reactive behavior to proactive choices. For example, when you feel a strong emotional reaction arising in response to an external event, take a step back and observe the emotion without judgment. Ask yourself, what is triggering me and why? Where is this feeling coming from? This self-inquiry process can help you to identify the shadow patterns and to start to take control of them. Instead of lashing out in anger, you might choose to take a deep breath and step away from the situation until you have had time to process the emotion. Instead of criticizing others, you might choose to look at your own behaviors and to see what is coming up for you. This process of self-awareness and conscious choice is an integral part of shadow integration, and it is an ongoing practice that we must commit to daily. The goal is not to suppress the shadow, but to channel its energy in a constructive direction. We do not want to live in a state of denial, but rather to create space for conscious action instead of unconscious reaction. And in this space, we can truly begin to transform our relationship with ourselves. As we begin to look toward the next part of our journey, we start to transition to a new perspective and to understanding the shadow's positive potential. It's often hard to see past the negative aspects of the shadow, but these qualities that we often reject also hold untapped strengths and creative energy. The very parts of ourselves that we dislike are often connected to our greatest potential. This is a crucial point as it moves the narrative beyond the challenges of shadow work into the transformative potential. It's a reminder that the shadow is not just a source of problems, but a wellspring of hidden talent and untapped possibilities. By understanding this paradox, we set the stage for the next stage of the journey, where we will explore how these disowned qualities, when integrated, can lead to a greater sense of personal power and creative potential. So, prepare to shift your perspective and to see your shadow in a whole new light. But what if the very aspects of ourselves that we tend to reject, the ones we often deem as negative, are actually the source of our greatest creative strengths? What if these so-called flaws are not obstacles, but the very fuel for innovation, artistic expression, and authentic leadership. This is where the narrative shifts, and we begin to see the shadow not just as a repository of darkness, but as a dynamic force with the potential for profound transformation. The traits we disown and suppress often contain untapped potential, and those who have learned to channel their inner darkness have often created some of the world's most powerful art, compelling narratives, and influential movements. It is through this integration that we can tap into the full spectrum of human potential. The initial belief that the shadow is solely a destructive force is challenged as we explore the creative wellspring hidden within its depths, a source of energy that remains unavailable until we consciously choose to engage with it. This is the paradox of the shadow, that within the darkness lies the very potential for brilliance, an idea that often requires a radical shift in perspective. Consider, for example, the life of Oscar Wilde, whose wit and flamboyant persona were often intertwined with the darker aspects of his psyche. His experiences of societal rejection fueled his creativity, and his willingness to embrace his shadow allowed him to produce works of profound beauty and insight. Or think of the music of Beethoven, whose personal struggles and inner demons found expression in his dramatic and moving symphonies. It is often through struggle and through the embrace of our darker sides that the greatest creativity arises. The shadow is not just a pit of negativity, but a wellspring of power that can be harnessed for good, and this is the perspective shift that allows us to move toward shadow integration with a new sense of hope and purpose. For many creative individuals, their shadow is the very wellspring of their inspiration, and their ability to transform these dark aspects into artistic forms is what sets them apart. But this transformative power of the shadow isn't limited to the world of art, but extends to all aspects of life. The shadow often contains unconventional strengths, talents, and perspectives that are often rejected because they don't fit within societal norms or personal ideals. These rejected qualities, when embraced and integrated, are often the very things that make us unique and interesting. It is often our shadow traits that make us stand out from the crowd, and the people who have learned to embrace their shadow are often the very people who leave a lasting impact on the world. When we allow ourselves to be different, rather than trying to fit in, we often start to see the unique value that we bring to the table, and we begin to understand that it is our unconventional strengths that are our greatest assets. A person who has always been told they are too emotional might find that their sensitivity transforms into powerful art, or empathetic leadership, a quality that is desperately needed in a world that often values logic over feeling. Or perhaps a person who was always seen as rebellious might channel that rebellious nature into becoming an innovative entrepreneur, changing the landscape of their industry and challenging the status quo. These examples show that it's not about eliminating these traits, but about understanding their potential and using them to create a positive impact in the world. The qualities we are often ashamed of are the very qualities that can make us extraordinary. It's about changing our perspective and understanding that our shadows are not weaknesses, but strengths waiting to be unleashed if we are brave enough to face them. This understanding of the shadow's potential requires us to revisit the shadow archetypes that we discussed earlier, but this time with a different lens, focusing on their positive potential when they are integrated. The tyrant, for example, can be transformed into a powerful leader who uses their assertiveness to protect the vulnerable and to stand up for what is right. The energy that was once used to dominate others can now be harnessed to empower them and to make the world a better place. Or the victim, when integrated, can become a compassionate healer who uses their experience to help others through their own struggles. The very pain that they once endured can be used as a source of empathy and wisdom, transforming their past into a powerful tool of transformation. And even the saboteur, the one who seems to always undermine our efforts, can become an innovative disruptor who challenges old patterns and creates a new way of doing things. It's about changing our relationship to these archetypes and not viewing them as something to eliminate, but as something to understand and use for good. These archetypes exist within us all, and our job is not to suppress them, but to learn how to use them consciously. It is through this understanding that we can begin to channel the shadow's energy into constructive actions, and thus show the true paradox of the shadow, that what we perceive as negative has within it the potential for the greatest good, and that the energy that was once used to harm can now be used to heal and to create. This transformation begins with a deeper understanding of the persona and how it often conflicts with our shadow. The persona, as we know, is the social mask that we wear, and it often presents an idealized version of ourselves to the world. But when we rely too heavily on the persona, we inevitably create a divide within ourselves, and this is often the source of our inner conflict. The more we try to suppress our shadow, the more our persona is likely to create problems in our lives, and this constant internal battle creates a sense of inauthenticity that can lead to deep dissatisfaction and a feeling that we are not living our true lives. When the persona becomes too rigid, it creates a prison for the soul, and it doesn't allow us to express our true feelings or desires. This suppression of our true selves leads to a deep feeling of being out of alignment with our values and a sense of disconnect with ourselves and the world. Consider someone who is constantly trying to maintain an image of perfection, constantly trying to appear strong and composed. They may be neglecting their true needs, their vulnerability, and their more emotional side. The persona, in this case, has become a barrier to their true self, and it has created a disconnect with those around them. This constant effort to maintain this facade often leads to exhaustion, emptiness, and a lack of genuine connection. And this is because they are not allowing themselves to be seen, truly seen. And this inability to be authentic prevents genuine relationships from being formed, as the persona is a mask, and we can never truly connect with a mask. The path toward authenticity, therefore, must involve an acknowledgement of the shadow, and it is this acknowledgement that will allow us to move toward integration. Shadow integration is, therefore, not just a theoretical concept, but an essential practice for living a more authentic life, and it's a key to becoming the person we were meant to be. By integrating our shadow, we free ourselves from the constant need to uphold an image, and we allow ourselves to show up in the world as our true selves, both light and dark. This is not about being perfect, but about being honest, open, and aligned with our true selves, and it is this authenticity that allows us to connect more deeply with ourselves and with others. When we embrace our shadow, we embrace the fullness of our being, and this often leads to greater self-acceptance and a feeling of inner peace. It is in this state of acceptance that we find true freedom, as we no longer have to pretend to be someone we are not. Imagine someone who has always felt the need to be agreeable and compliant. By integrating their shadow, they might discover their own assertiveness and their ability to stand up for what they believe in. Or perhaps someone who has always been very critical of others. By integrating their shadow, they might discover their own vulnerability and become more accepting of their own flaws. This is not just about accepting our negative traits, but it's about embracing the whole human experience and freeing ourselves from the burden of always trying to be someone we are not. True authenticity cannot occur until the shadow is acknowledged, and it is only through this process that we can truly step into our true selves. And it is often in our imperfections that we find the most beautiful aspects of our nature. And this brings us to the power of vulnerability as a key aspect of shadow integration. In a society that often values strength and perfection, vulnerability is often seen as a weakness. But in reality, it is one of the most courageous things we can do. Embracing our imperfections and showing them to the world often makes us more relatable, trustworthy, and powerful, and it creates space for deeper connections with ourselves and others. When we are willing to show our weaknesses, we allow others to see their own, and we often become a beacon of hope, a reminder that we are all in this together. It is through vulnerability that we discover our shared humanity and we create space for empathy and compassion. Consider a leader who is willing to admit when they are wrong and to share their own struggles. This leader will likely inspire more trust and loyalty from their team than a leader who always pretends to know everything. Or take a creative person who is willing to share their struggles, their insecurities, and the imperfect process of their work. They will likely connect with their audience more deeply than someone who is constantly trying to hide their flaws. This vulnerability is not a sign of weakness, but instead, it's a sign of courage, and this is where true connection to ourselves and others happens. And it's through this connection that we become more whole and more authentic. This shadow integration is not just about self-acceptance, but it's also about reclaiming our personal power and agency. The parts of ourselves that we reject often hold a lot of energy and potential, and by integrating them, we can tap into this source of power. The energy that we were using to suppress our shadow can now be rechanneled toward positive goals, and it frees us from the constant internal battle and allows us to direct our energy more effectively. It is not about becoming something we are not, but about becoming the fullest version of ourselves, and by doing this, we step into our true power. Consider someone who has always been plagued by self-doubt, who has never truly believed in themselves. By embracing their shadow, they may discover their inner strength, their confidence, and they may finally start to believe in their own abilities. They become a confident and decisive leader, and their self-doubt becomes the very fuel for their growth. Or perhaps someone who has always been very passive and avoided confrontation, by embracing their shadow, they might discover their ability to assert themselves, to set boundaries, and to stand up for their own needs. This shift in perspective often creates more control over our inner world, and we start to understand that our negative traits are not weaknesses, but potential strengths. This transformation doesn't happen overnight, but it is a process of gradual integration, and over time it leads to a greater sense of empowerment. This empowerment is rooted in taking full responsibility for our shadow, and this process of shadow integration is not about blaming others for our problems, but about recognizing our role in creating our own experiences. Integration means owning all aspects of ourselves, both light and dark, and understanding that we are the authors of our own lives. And this is what it means to become a truly responsible adult. It is through this ownership that we can begin to consciously shape our own destiny and move away from a victim mentality toward one of true empowerment. Consider someone who is always blaming others for their problems, for their lack of success, and their dissatisfaction with their life. They may have been stuck in a cycle of victimhood, always feeling like they have no control. By taking responsibility for their shadow, they can start to understand their own role in these cycles and start to make different choices. They may recognize that their own negative emotions were influencing their decisions and their behaviors, and by owning this, they can start to change their life for the better. This is about owning our own actions, our choices, and our own feelings, and it's not about condoning harmful behavior, but instead it is about understanding that we have the power to change. By acknowledging and accepting the shadow, we become empowered to shape our own realities. This understanding of the shadow leads to a sense of personal empowerment that allows us to make more conscious choices, and we can consciously choose how we want to show up in the world, instead of reacting to unconscious impulses. It frees us from being at the mercy of our shadow and moves us toward a space where we have more control over our actions and our decisions. This is about becoming a conscious creator of our life instead of a victim of circumstances, and it allows us to move beyond limiting beliefs to a life of endless possibilities. When we consciously engage with our shadow, we step into our true power and we reclaim our agency. When we embrace our shadow, we are no longer controlled by it, but we have become the ones in control. We are not eliminating the darkness, but we are integrating it, understanding it, and using it as a force for good. This is the ultimate goal of shadow integration, and it is not just about healing our wounds, but about becoming a more powerful version of ourselves. Consider a person who was once afraid of conflict and who would always avoid it at all costs. By integrating their shadow, they may start to understand the value of healthy conflict, and they may learn to assert their needs in a respectful way, and in turn, they become a better leader and a better communicator. And through this process of integration, they have finally stepped into their true power, and they are no longer being held back by the fear that used to control them. Embracing our shadow allows us to live a more authentic, empowered, and intentional life. So now that we've explored the destructive aspects of the shadow and the power it has when integrated, it's important to briefly recap the key concepts and then begin to move toward the practical applications of this knowledge. The shadow, as we have come to understand, is not simply about negative traits, but about all of the disowned and unexplored parts of ourselves, both good and bad. It is the side of ourselves that we have rejected or have forgotten, and it's the source of our greatest struggles, as well as our greatest potential. We have explored how projection leads us to see our own shadow aspects in others, and how this can create cycles of conflict. But we have also explored how integration can lead us to greater self-awareness, authenticity, and personal power. The key is to understand that the shadow is a paradox, both a source of problems and a source of creative energy, and when understood and integrated, we can tap into the full spectrum of human potential. But it is important to remember that simply understanding the concept is not enough. Now is the time to take this knowledge into the practical realm. It's crucial to emphasize that knowledge alone is not enough to transform our relationship with the shadow, and it requires active effort and practice. Understanding the concepts is the first step, but the true transformation comes from implementing what we have learned and consciously working to integrate the shadow into our lives. Now is the time to move from theory to practice, from the intellectual to the embodied, and to start taking practical steps to change our relationship with ourselves. We have spent time exploring the patterns, understanding the concepts, but now we must move from the conceptual to the practical. It's time to make this information actionable and to begin the journey of shadow integration in a tangible way. This work requires both self-compassion and a willingness to challenge our comfort zones, but it will always lead to growth. We are now at the turning point of the video, where we shift from the theoretical to the actionable, from understanding to implementation. It's one thing to know about the shadow. It's another thing to do the work required to integrate it into our lives. And so, we now turn our attention to the practical methods that will guide you on your journey of shadow integration, and we'll start to explore specific techniques for self-inquiry, active imagination, and ongoing shadow work, so you can start to implement these steps in your own life. This process requires patience, self-compassion, and a willingness to explore uncomfortable truths about ourselves, and it is an ongoing journey, not a quick fix. Shadow work is not a one-time event, but it is a lifelong commitment to self-discovery and a process of continually coming to know ourselves more intimately. The goal of these methods is to empower you with the tools necessary to engage with the shadow consciously and to use its energy for growth and transformation. In the next sections, we will delve into these methods with the purpose of providing you with the specific steps you can use to begin your own journey of shadow integration. The journey of shadow integration, though, is not without its challenges, and a crucial aspect of this process involves understanding the significant dangers that arise when we suppress our shadow. The act of trying to keep our shadow hidden consumes a tremendous amount of psychic energy that could otherwise be directed toward more productive and fulfilling aspects of our lives. Think of it as trying to hold a beach ball underwater. The more force you exert to keep it submerged, the more powerfully it will eventually burst forth, often at the most unexpected and inopportune moments. This constant internal struggle to maintain a perfect persona, this relentless attempt to present a flawless image to the world, becomes an exhausting endeavor, and it leads to a state of chronic fatigue, heightened stress levels, and a pervasive sense of emptiness. It's a negative feedback loop, where the more energy we spend trying to control our inner darkness, the less energy we have available for genuine self-expression and meaningful engagement with the world around us. It is a futile battle that will always ultimately end in defeat, because the shadow, if not acknowledged, will always find a way to make itself known, often in ways that cause more problems than if it was addressed consciously. This process becomes a kind of self-imprisonment, where the fear of our own darkness robs us of the vitality and joy that are essential components of a fulfilling life. The suppression of the shadow is therefore not a sustainable strategy, but rather a recipe for inner turmoil and dissatisfaction. The truth is, these suppressed shadow traits don't simply disappear. Instead, they often manifest in unconscious ways, undermining our best intentions and creating patterns of self-sabotage. These are not random events, but rather the shadow's way of making its presence known, expressing itself when we least expect it. For example, someone who consciously strives to be calm and collected might suddenly find themselves lashing out in anger, despite their best efforts to remain composed. This is not a sign of personal failing, but rather an indication that the shadow is seeking expression, and it does so in ways that can be incredibly damaging to our relationships, careers, and general well-being. These unconscious shadow manifestations often create patterns that we don't understand, leaving us feeling confused, frustrated, and powerless to change. We may find ourselves repeatedly engaging in behaviors that undermine our own goals and that we're struggling to understand. This can be a pattern of procrastination, sudden outbursts of rage, or impulsive choices that have negative consequences. These are all ways that the shadow will find an outlet, and the longer we ignore these patterns, the more likely they are to become deeply ingrained in our lives. The shadow, if ignored, will always find a way to express itself, and it will often cause much more damage than if it were confronted directly. And this leads to a crucial understanding. Suppressing the shadow only amplifies its power. The more we try to ignore it, the more dominant and destructive it becomes. It's a paradoxical situation where the very act of trying to control our darkness inadvertently feeds it. When we refuse to acknowledge our shadow traits, they don't just stay dormant. Instead, they become a hidden force that gradually gains control over our lives, leading to more significant problems over time. This creates an internal pressure cooker, where the repressed shadow traits build up until they eventually explode. Consider someone who attempts to suppress their anger, only to have it erupt at a completely inappropriate moment, causing significant damage to relationships and their reputation. The harder we try to suppress it, the more forcefully it will manifest, and the more damage it will likely cause to our lives. This hidden pressure will often cause more damage than if we dealt with the issue directly. The act of suppression is therefore not a solution, but rather an amplification of the problem, and it creates a sense of urgency to engage with the shadow. The longer we try to run from it, the more powerful it becomes, and the more it will inevitably dictate our lives. This understanding shows the critical need to change our relationship with the shadow from one of suppression to one of acceptance and understanding. Therefore, the antidote to this destructive pattern of suppression is self-awareness, as it provides a powerful tool for understanding the shadow and for beginning the process of integration. It is the first step toward reclaiming our inner power, and it starts with a simple act of noticing, observing, and acknowledging the existence of our shadow without judgment. This doesn't require us to instantly understand why the shadow exists or even to like it, but simply to become aware of its presence and how it influences our thoughts, feelings, and actions. It is about becoming a conscious observer of our own inner world without trying to change it or control it. This act of witnessing allows us to start to recognize patterns, understand triggers, and ultimately take more control of our responses. It's not about beating ourselves up for having a shadow, but about becoming conscious of its influence in our lives and making a conscious decision to move towards integration instead of suppression. And it is through this self-observation that we begin to unravel the mysteries of the shadow and to start our journey of transformation. It is in our awareness that we find the power to move beyond self-sabotage to a life of conscious choice and self-compassion. And it's through acceptance that we finally start the journey of true shadow integration. This doesn't mean condoning negative behavior, but it does mean acknowledging the shadow as a natural and inevitable part of the human experience. It means moving beyond feelings of shame and guilt, and instead approaching our shadow with curiosity and understanding. We must accept all parts of ourselves, including the dark ones, and realize that these rejected parts are just as valuable as the parts we often consider good. It is this radical self-acceptance that allows us to finally move toward wholeness, and it is the key that unlocks the prison of self-condemnation. Acceptance is not about liking the shadow, but about acknowledging its existence without feeling shame or guilt. This shift in perspective allows us to stop fighting against ourselves and to move toward a more compassionate relationship with our inner world and the patterns that influence our life. It is about creating a space within ourselves where all parts are welcome and where we can move from fear to compassion, and both for ourselves and for others. This acceptance frees us from the internal battle with the shadow, allowing us to direct our energy toward more meaningful pursuits instead of the constant battle that is required by suppression. And this brings us to the power of compassion as the final key to shadow integration. Approaching our shadow with empathy and understanding is essential, and it requires recognizing that our shadow traits often develop because of past traumas, negative experiences, and societal conditioning. It is about understanding that the shadow is not a sign of being bad, but an indication of the wounds that we have accumulated throughout our lives, and therefore it is worthy of compassion. Self-compassion is not about being weak or excusing bad behavior, but it's about recognizing our shared humanity and allowing ourselves to be seen with both our strengths and our weaknesses. It is about moving past blaming ourselves for having a shadow and instead looking at it through the lens of compassion and using that awareness to heal and to move toward a place of wholeness. This act of compassion enables us to move beyond self-condemnation and into a space where we can see our shadow with understanding and without judgment. It is about extending to ourselves the same kindness and understanding that we would offer to a friend who is going through a difficult time, and through this, we can start the journey of true shadow integration. By seeing our shadow with compassion, we create space for healing, growth, and transformation. Now, let's shift our focus from theoretical concepts to the practical realm and explore how we can navigate the challenges of the shadow in our daily lives. The first step in this process is to identify our shadow triggers, those moments that cause strong emotional reactions. These triggers are often signals of unresolved shadow traits, and understanding them allows us to gain insights into our own inner landscape. Common shadow triggers include criticism, judgment, and feelings of inadequacy. Seemingly minor comments at work or simple interactions with loved ones can often trigger a strong emotional response, and when they do, this is often a sign of unresolved shadow traits bubbling up to the surface. These moments are not random occurrences, but rather they are indicators of the specific areas within ourselves that are still hurting and in need of our attention. The key is to not avoid these emotions, but to use them as a map to understand our hidden darkness and to begin to take a closer look at the emotions, patterns, and situations that cause us to react in a powerful way. These triggers, if looked at consciously, can become clues to the aspects of ourselves that are still hurting, and they can point us toward a path of healing and integration. The recognition of these triggers is not a sign of weakness, but a powerful tool for self-awareness and transformation. And now that we've established the importance of trigger identification, let's explore the next crucial step, which is how to respond consciously to those triggers. This isn't about suppressing emotions or pretending that they don't exist, but it is about choosing our responses instead of reacting automatically from a place of pain. The first step involves recognizing when you are being triggered, then taking a pause before reacting. This pause allows us to create a space between stimulus and response, and instead of reacting from a place of unconsciousness, we can make a deliberate choice of how to respond. Instead of lashing out, we can take a moment to observe our feelings and then choose an intentional action. This might mean taking a deep breath, journaling about the trigger, or simply taking a walk to clear our head. The key is to become aware of what is happening and make a conscious choice to respond with intention, instead of reacting from a place of unconscious patterns and repressed emotions. This process is about moving from automatic reactions to intentional actions, and it allows us to take more control over our internal landscape and to make choices from a place of consciousness instead of a place of fear. And here's the revolutionary idea that can transform our entire perspective on shadow triggers. These moments of intense emotional reaction are not just moments of pain and reactivity, but can actually be powerful opportunities for growth. When triggers appear, they're often signaling that we are ready to explore deeper aspects of our psyche, and they point to the areas where we need to do more shadow work. These moments can become invitations to go deeper, to question our assumptions, and to discover the hidden dynamics of our unconscious world. It's often when we are most uncomfortable that we are on the cusp of the greatest growth. Instead of avoiding our triggers, we can see them as valuable sources of self-discovery and as the path to our own transformation. They are not random events, but rather they are signs that we are ready to engage with our shadow in a new way, and this awareness allows us to use our triggers for something greater that moves us toward healing. These triggers show us the places within us that need more compassion, understanding, and ultimately healing. Now, let's broaden our view and explore the collective implications of the shadow, moving beyond the individual to see how these patterns play out on a global scale. Larger-scale conflicts and injustices are often rooted in collective shadow projections. These aren't random events, but rather they are based on repeating patterns that are often ignored, and they manifest as a culture projecting its shadow onto other groups, often resulting in discrimination, persecution, and even genocide. These are not just historical events, but they are recurring themes that are present in the world today. It's critical to understand that these societal patterns are directly linked to the unacknowledged shadow aspects of a culture, and that these patterns will continue until we become aware of them and start to take responsibility. Just as individuals project their shadows onto others, so too do entire groups and societies, and the implications of this are far-reaching. Understanding these dynamics is essential to navigating the world in a more conscious and compassionate way, and it requires that we each take responsibility for our own role in the collective shadow. By understanding these collective dynamics, we can start to understand why we're seeing the same patterns over and over again. This dynamic becomes particularly clear when we look at the us versus them mentality as a significant indicator of collective shadow projection. This is a pattern that often leads to a society creating an external enemy so that it doesn't have to face its own internal darkness. Think of political movements, often using propaganda to demonize their opponents, creating a narrative of us versus them. These are all signs of the collective shadow at work. Societies often seek a scapegoat, an external group, or a person to blame for their problems, and this allows them to avoid taking responsibility for their own internal conflicts. The divisions and conflicts that we see in the world today are often reflections of our own internal struggles and our own unacknowledged shadows. And it is crucial to understand that these patterns will continue to be repeated until we collectively decide to confront our shadows and take responsibility for our actions. It requires looking deeply at the parts of ourselves that we reject and coming to terms with our own role in creating conflict, and it is the only path towards real healing. Therefore, we see the essential need for collective shadow integration, and in fact, if we want to create a more peaceful and harmonious world, we must confront our collective darkness. This requires individuals to work on themselves and to take responsibility for their own personal shadow. As more individuals begin the process of shadow integration, it will start to make a change in the collective. The path towards a more peaceful world begins with self-awareness, understanding, and compassion, and it's rooted in the understanding that we cannot create a more harmonious society until we address our own internal conflicts. It is the responsibility of each individual to engage in shadow work, and by doing this, we start to take the steps necessary to change the collective. It is through this process that we move beyond conflict and toward a world that is based on understanding, compassion, and peace. This collective transformation begins within each of us, and it has the potential to transform the world. Let's now examine the complex dance of shadow projection in the intimate spaces of our relationships and see how these unconscious dynamics play out, often creating patterns of conflict and dissatisfaction. Consider, for instance, a couple, Sarah and Tom. Sarah often presents herself as the responsible and organized one, and she is always seeking approval and validation from Tom. She tends to criticize Tom for his lack of planning and his seemingly carefree attitude, often labeling him as irresponsible. Tom, on the other hand, tends to be more spontaneous and less concerned with structure. He often feels suffocated by Sarah's need for control, and he often responds by withdrawing emotionally or by making impulsive decisions that he knows will bother Sarah. What's happening beneath the surface of this relationship? Sarah is unconsciously projecting her own shadow's need for validation onto Tom, constantly seeking his approval to feel worthy. Her criticism of Tom's lack of planning is a reflection of her own inner critic that constantly judges her for not being perfect. Tom, on the other hand, is embodying her disowned spontaneity and is reacting to her controlling nature as a rejection of his own freedom, creating a negative feedback loop where both are playing out the shadow aspects of the other person. This pattern is not unique to them, it's a common dynamic where each person is unconsciously enacting a part of the other's shadow, and these patterns are almost always invisible to those involved in the relationship unless they are made conscious. And what happens when these unconscious shadow dynamics are left unaddressed? The relationship can quickly devolve into a cycle of chronic conflict, resentment, and blame. Sarah becomes increasingly critical and demanding, while Tom becomes more withdrawn, leading to a sense of emotional distance and a loss of intimacy. They might find themselves caught in a repeating pattern, where each is blaming the other for the problems in the relationship, completely blind to their own contribution. And this is precisely how the shadow often sabotages even the most well-intentioned relationships. This pattern can escalate over time, leading to a complete breakdown of communication and trust. As both are so wrapped up in their own perspective, they are unable to see their role in the negative dynamic. The key point here is that neither Sarah nor Tom are intentionally trying to create this conflict, but their unconscious shadows are driving the conflict, and that without understanding these dynamics, they're destined to repeat these patterns in all future relationships. It is not enough to blame the other person. It is essential to see our own role in the process and to be accountable for the impact that our own shadow has on those around us. This requires looking within and taking ownership of our own internal landscape. Furthermore, this pattern of projecting our shadow onto others is not limited to romantic relationships. It can also be a common theme between family members, where similar dynamics can be found between parents and children, siblings, and other close relations. Think of a parent who is overly controlling, who then criticizes their child for not being independent, which often reflects the parent's own disowned need for control. Or consider a sibling who is constantly seeking attention while accusing the other of being selfish, which is often a reflection of their own internal feelings of insecurity and their own desire for attention. These family dynamics are not random occurrences. They're patterns driven by unconscious shadow projections that are passed from generation to generation. The key point here is that we're often drawn to people who embody the qualities that we have disowned in ourselves, and these attractions are not random. They're often based on hidden desires, fears, and unresolved wounds, and the more conscious we become of these patterns, the better we will be able to understand our own inner workings and the roles that we play in our relationships. Let's now turn our attention to the often overlooked shadow dynamics within the workplace, where the pursuit of power, recognition, and success can often trigger our most unconscious behaviors. Consider the case of Mark, a manager who is known for being overly critical and demanding, often micromanaging his team and creating a stressful work environment. He views himself as a high achiever and often judges others for not meeting his standards and for his inability to understand his methods or his high expectations. But what is really going on here? Mark's behavior might stem from his own deep-seated insecurity and his own fear of failure, which he is projecting onto his team members. His hypercritical approach is not a sign of his high standards, but rather, it's a reflection of his own inner critic that constantly judges him for not being perfect. He unconsciously projects his own fear of being inadequate onto others, and then criticizes them for not being good enough. Mark might believe he is simply being a good manager, but his actions reveal a deeper, unconscious motivation. It is the shadow at work, and if left unacknowledged, it will continue to impact his team in a negative way. This is not an isolated case. These types of behaviors are often a symptom of unacknowledged shadow dynamics in the workplace. Moreover, within this type of environment, competition and sabotage can become common practices, with colleagues undermining each other, sabotaging projects, and engaging in gossip and backstabbing, often driven by their own hidden insecurities and a desire for control. Think of colleagues who are constantly trying to one-up each other, or those who spread rumors or take credit for other people's ideas. These behaviors are not merely personality flaws, but rather they are manifestations of unacknowledged shadows at play, which often creates a toxic workplace culture. It is in these moments that the collective shadow of the organization comes to the forefront, revealing the unacknowledged darkness that often lurks beneath the surface. These behaviors often start with leaders or key influencers in the company and often create a culture of fear and distrust, where employees are afraid to speak their minds or to offer innovative ideas. This creates a culture where the shadow thrives because it is ignored and even encouraged, and this ultimately leads to a system of internal sabotage. This is not about blaming individuals. It is about acknowledging the systemic impact of unintegrated shadows on workplace culture. And what are the consequences when these unintegrated shadow dynamics are allowed to flourish within a workplace environment? The impact is far-reaching, leading to decreased productivity, low morale, and increased employee turnover. When people feel unsupported, undervalued, and constantly under pressure, their motivation will plummet, and their engagement with their work decreases substantially. This creates an environment of resentment and distrust, where employees are not able to achieve their full potential, and where creativity, innovation, and collaboration are stifled. Unresolved shadow issues can create a toxic environment where people become disengaged, and where the company suffers as a whole. The key point here is that the shadow, if left unaddressed, will continue to erode the foundation of any workplace culture, and that all organizations are vulnerable to these dynamics. It is not enough to focus on surface-level solutions. We must address the underlying psychological factors that are contributing to these negative patterns, and it requires an understanding of the shadow. But let's shift our focus now, from the problems created by an unintegrated shadow to a place of hope, by exploring examples of individuals who have successfully integrated their shadows, showing us that this journey is not only possible, but deeply transformative. Consider the story of Emily, who was once plagued by self-doubt and insecurity. She constantly compared herself to others and often sabotaged her own success. She had a pattern of procrastination and would often give up on her goals because she believed she wasn't good enough. But through a process of shadow work, Emily was able to transform her life. She started by journaling and by exploring her recurring patterns, as well as any triggers that came up. She identified that her self-doubt stemmed from her fear of not being loved or accepted, and that these fears were related to experiences she had in her childhood. Through this process, Emily was able to find a compassionate space for her wounded inner child, and to move from a place of self-judgment to a place of self-compassion. And as a result, she was able to increase her confidence, feel a greater sense of self-worth, and improve her relationships. Her story demonstrates that through conscious shadow work, it is possible to move from a place of despair to a place of inner peace. This isn't just a theoretical idea, but rather a tangible example of the power of shadow integration. And this same principle can also be applied to creativity, by demonstrating how artists, writers, and innovators have channeled their shadow aspects into their creative expressions. Take, for example, the musician, Alex, who struggled with addiction and turned his painful experiences into a powerful and moving album that resonated with millions of people. This wasn't just a creative endeavor. It was a powerful act of shadow integration, where he was able to transform his pain into beauty, and by doing so, also created a space for healing, both for himself and for his listeners. It's not just about eliminating the shadow, but about using it wisely, as it often contains incredible amounts of power and dynamic energy that can be harnessed for good. Think of countless examples of artists and writers who used their inner darkness as a source of inspiration, proving that the path to true creative potential often lies through embracing instead of denying the shadow. By doing this, they transform their pain into purpose, allowing them to tap into a wellspring of creativity that they never knew existed. This is where true genius is often born, not just in the light, but also in the darkness. Furthermore, let's explore how shadow integration plays out in leadership, and how this often creates more effective leaders. Consider the story of Michael, who used to be seen as a controlling and authoritarian manager, and through shadow work, he transformed into a collaborative, compassionate, and effective leader. He realized that his need for control was a result of his own insecurities and his own fear of not being seen as a capable leader. Through this awareness, Michael began to create a culture where people felt safe to express their ideas and where collaboration was encouraged, leading to a more productive and enjoyable work environment. He also started to connect with his team on a more personal level, and by acknowledging his own imperfections, he created a space where others could do the same. His story demonstrates that shadow integration is not a sign of weakness, but it's a sign of strength, and that true leadership starts with the ability to lead ourselves and to understand our own inner world. This shows that understanding our own shadow allows us to lead others from a place of empathy and authenticity, and the impact is far-reaching. So, how do we start this journey of shadow integration? It begins with practical self-inquiry techniques, and these practices are not difficult or time-consuming, but they do require consistency and a willingness to face our inner selves with honesty and vulnerability. Start by asking yourself these questions. What situations trigger my strongest emotional reactions? What qualities do I dislike most in others? What recurring patterns can I identify in my life? Use these questions as journaling prompts, and then track your responses, looking for repeating themes and figures, creating a detailed map of your shadow's landscape. It's through this consistent practice that we begin to unravel the mysteries of our own inner world, and that allows us to create awareness around our triggers, our patterns, and our reactions. And remember that this is not a one-time activity. It's an ongoing practice that needs to be incorporated into our daily lives. And another powerful technique for engaging with your shadow is through active imagination. This is a method to directly connect with your shadow, and it can be incredibly transformative. Find a quiet place where you can relax, and then set an intention to connect with your shadow. Then visualize your shadow as a specific figure, character, or symbol that represents the dark aspects of your own psyche. Once you have a clear image, begin to engage in a dialogue by asking questions and then patiently listening to their responses. What do you need? Why are you sabotaging me? What can I do to help you? The answers you receive may not always be clear, but the key is to stay open, to keep asking, and to allow the process to unfold naturally. This approach is about creating a safe space for your shadow to express itself, and it's through listening to your shadow that you will start to truly understand it. This is a critical step towards shadow integration, and when done with consistency, it becomes an extremely powerful tool for transformation. And finally, we must take the insights gained from self-inquiry and active imagination and integrate them into our daily lives. This means learning to recognize when you are being triggered by your shadow and creating a pause before reacting. It is about noticing the patterns and then making a conscious choice about how you will respond instead of reacting automatically from a place of unconsciousness. It requires patience, self-compassion, and a willingness to face the uncomfortable truths about ourselves and to realize that it's about progress, not perfection. Each small step you take is a step towards greater wholeness. By integrating your shadow insights into your daily life, you transform your triggers from a place of reactivity into a place of choice. And by doing this, you start to live more consciously, more authentically, and with more self-awareness. This is not the end of the journey, but it is a pivotal step towards living with your shadow, instead of being controlled by it. As we've journeyed through the complexities of the shadow, we've seen its destructive potential, its hidden influence, and its surprising capacity for transformation. But now, let's arrive at the ultimate truth, the final revelation, that the shadow isn't just a dark force, but it acts as a mirror, reflecting back to us the very aspects of ourselves that we reject, but that also hold our greatest potential. When we look at our shadow, we are not merely confronting a hidden adversary. We are actually looking at our own reflection, revealing the depths of our inner world. This mirrors back to the initial question of the hidden forces at play within us. But now, we see that these hidden forces are also the source of our untapped potential. Just as a physical mirror reflects our outward appearance, the shadow mirrors our inner landscape, showing us both our perceived weaknesses and our latent abilities. Consider this. When we confront our shadow, we aren't just facing our demons. We are also confronting our unrealized talents, our suppressed passions, and the parts of ourselves that we've hidden away. The shadow is the place where our fears reside, but also where our greatest strengths are found. It is a paradox that challenges the simplistic idea of good versus evil and invites us to look deeper at the full scope of our inner selves. It's within this reflection, within this mirror, that we can finally begin to see the whole picture. Furthermore, the shadow embodies a profound duality, representing the full spectrum of human nature, containing both destructive and creative forces, and it is through the integration of this duality that we become more whole. Rejecting the shadow means rejecting a part of ourselves, which creates an internal conflict, and this work is about coming into harmony with all aspects of who we are. The shadow is not meant to be eradicated, but integrated, thus creating a more balanced and complete human being. True integration is about embracing the light and the dark, the good and the bad, the strengths and the weaknesses. It's about bringing all aspects into a harmonious whole. Think of it as an orchestra, where all the different instruments, even the seemingly dissonant ones, play a critical role in creating the complete symphony. Ignoring the shadow would be like only listening to half of the orchestra or attempting to silence all the instruments that we don't like. It is in accepting both the light and the dark that we become whole, and in this wholeness, we find true power and fulfillment. It is only through integration that we are able to create the full symphony of our lives, and the ultimate transformation comes not from eliminating the shadow, but by accepting it completely, and when we do this, it loses its power over us. This acceptance allows us to move from a place of internal conflict to a place of inner peace, thus fostering greater self-awareness, self-compassion, and a more authentic way of being, bringing together the major threads of the video and completing the journey of understanding that the goal is integration, not elimination. Consider that by accepting our shadow, we disarm its destructive power, we free ourselves from its unconscious grip, and we unlock its creative potential. When we stop fighting against ourselves, we free up energy, and we allow space for growth and evolution. True freedom is not about being perfect. It's about understanding our imperfections and learning to love and accept all the aspects of ourselves, including those we have tried to hide. This is a process of self-discovery and self-acceptance, where we learn to embrace all the different parts of who we are. When we stop the internal war against our shadow, we are free to fully live, love, and create. Now let's consider the profound implications of shadow integration and how our individual work connects to the larger world, and see how these personal journeys contribute to a more conscious and compassionate society. As individuals, when we integrate our shadow, we contribute to a more conscious world, because by taking responsibility for our internal landscape, we also take responsibility for our external actions, thus breaking down the barriers of us versus them. We've seen how collective shadows can create division, conflict, and injustice, and it's by healing our individual wounds that we contribute to healing the collective wounds of the world. The more we are willing to explore our personal darkness, the more compassion, understanding, and acceptance we are able to bring to the world, and this will create a positive ripple effect. When we take responsibility for our own inner world, we are not only healing ourselves, but also contributing to the healing of our communities, our cultures, and the planet as a whole. Remember that the internal and the external are connected, and we cannot change the world without first changing ourselves. It is when we heal individually that we start to see this change ripple out to the collective. And by understanding our own shadow, we become less likely to project it onto others, which in turn reduces the likelihood of collective conflict, prejudice, and injustice. Projection is a dangerous pattern that we must break, and it starts by taking responsibility for our internal landscape. When we no longer project our shadows onto others, we are less likely to engage in dehumanization and othering, which are the root causes of conflict and discrimination. And when we can see the truth, we are less likely to perceive others as enemies. We must understand that when we are triggered by another person, it's a signal that we need to explore that aspect within ourselves and to take responsibility for our own inner world. This is not about blaming others for our reactions, but about recognizing that our reactions are often a reflection of unresolved internal conflicts. By doing this inner work, we are not only improving our relationships, but also creating a more just and peaceful world. This is not just a personal journey. It is a deeply meaningful contribution to the collective. And finally, shadow integration is not just a personal journey. It's also a form of social activism, because when we work on ourselves, we're actively contributing to a better world. True change always starts from within, and it is the only way to create long-lasting positive impact. By transforming our internal landscape, we are changing the world. By embracing the entirety of our human experience, we create a world where others can do the same. Shadow work is a way to challenge social norms, power structures, and systems that are rooted in collective shadow projections. And when enough individuals begin to heal, there will be a significant shift in the world. Personal transformation is not separate from the world. Rather, it's the foundation of true social justice, freedom, and equality. The journey is both internal and external, and it is only through the integration of both that we can truly transform ourselves and the world. This is how we create a more just, equal, and compassionate society for everyone. But it's also important to acknowledge that shadow integration is not a one-time fix, but a lifelong journey of self-discovery and growth, which requires time, patience, and ongoing dedication, and that it's not about arriving at a perfect state, but about constantly learning, growing, and evolving. There is no final destination on the path of self-discovery. It is a process of continuous unfolding, and that the shadow will always be a part of us. This work is about building a better relationship with the shadow instead of trying to eliminate it. It's about cultivating self-awareness, self-compassion, and a commitment to personal growth. This journey is ongoing, but through consistent work, we become more aware, empowered, and resilient. It's the journey itself that transforms us, and it is through the conscious engagement with our shadow that we uncover new layers of awareness which will empower us along the way. This is not a sprint, but a marathon, and requires commitment and dedication. And within this journey, we must embrace our imperfections, because these are what make us uniquely human and the key to our growth. And when we accept our flaws, we become more compassionate, understanding, and resilient, freeing ourselves from the illusion of perfection. Flaws are not something to be ashamed of, but rather a part of what makes us who we are. We are all imperfect beings doing our best, and it is from this imperfection that we are able to grow. It is our flaws and imperfections that often lead us on our most transformative paths, and also what makes us unique and different. The goal is not to eliminate our flaws, but to love them as part of who we are. It is through this acceptance that we find true inner peace, and that we learn to love all parts of ourselves. It is this love and acceptance that will give us the courage to keep moving forward, even when things are difficult. And finally, remember that the exploration of the shadow is a source of ongoing discovery, and that by engaging with this work, we become more aware, empowered, and aligned with our true selves. Make shadow work a part of your ongoing journey towards wholeness, and make a conscious choice to engage with it each day. The more we engage with our shadow, the more we understand ourselves. It's a continuous journey of uncovering new layers of our unconscious, and it is a path to greater liberation. This is not just a one-time activity, but rather a lifelong commitment to living in a more conscious way, and it is a journey that will never end, but will bring you closer to your true self. This is where you find your greatest source of power, not by denying the shadow, but by understanding it. So now, as we come to the end of this journey, let me leave you with a few final questions, designed to encourage your continued reflection. What hidden talents might your shadow be trying to reveal? How can you use your shadow's energy for good? And what steps will you take today to engage with your shadow? Use these prompts to continue your exploration, and let your curiosity be your guide. Let this be your invitation to go deeper. And please, do not go on this journey alone. Share your thoughts, your questions, and your insights in the comment section, and connect with others who are also on this path, thus creating a sense of community and support. I have also added links to other resources for further learning to help you on your own journey. And now, as we conclude this exploration, let me leave you with this powerful call to action. Embrace your shadow, for the path to a more fulfilling life lies within, and it is through this integration that you will transform yourself and the world. The time is now. The journey starts with you. Embrace your shadow and step into your power.